It's mid latish December. I don't even know what day it is because I don't keep track of days anymore. It's a week before Christmas. That much I know. So 25 minus 7. The 18th? No,
Yes, sir.
16th. Something like that. But yeah, so we're doing a live battle language, and we're going to talk about whatever. We have a couple of guests in our battle language Discord. Uh, some familiar names if you've seen other episodes of Battle Language. So we have Jaded with us, and we have Mr. Nobody. Others may
Hello,
pop in,
hello.
and if they do, that's great. And presumably, there's a way to see the chat if we I know we have like one person watching currently. Um, yeah, this
Well,
is
of
my first
course I
time
know
doing
him.
this.
He's me.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out. All right. Um, so yeah, we're going to talk about Dune stuff. So I had a couple of people did send me a couple of questions that they hoped that we would answer and talk about. One had to do with pretty straightforward, I think, but it was Bene Gesserit advisors and ECAS with Occupy. And I guess the short answer, well, and I guess part of it is complicated by the old FAQ, what I'm calling now the old FAQ. There's going to be a new FAQ that is coming out that um, answers some new questions, of course. But one of the things that it does do is it does a little bit of a 180 on some of the Bene Gesserit elements. And part of that was we had a discussion, and it's funny because this discussion is now probably a year old, with the original designers talking about advisors, talking about design intent. But the other thing that happened was taking a look at how the coexistence worked with the Avalon Hill edition. So it's a little bit different, and part of that is because the Avalon Hill tokens were just blue tokens, so they didn't have two states. There wasn't a this is a fighter, this is an advisor on the back, which I think is a pretty good innovation for the Gale Force 9 edition. It helps players tell at a glance where you are coexisting. And the rules on the coexistence and whether or not you were didn't really align with what was in the old FAQ. So we'll have a whole episode on the new FAQ when it does get published. Gale Force 9 has it. They're formatting it. They're doing whatever it is they're going to do to it. So the official ruling is going to be that advisors can be in a territory with their allies. So if the Bene Gesserit are allied with ECAS, they can have the advisors in that same territory. Of course, as advisors, they don't really have any effect on gameplay, so they would not count. If you had advisors and ECAS in a stronghold, that does not count as one of the three strongholds you need to co-occupy in order to win with the ECAS alliance. So, and that I think that was at the heart of the question was, oh, can I just be advising and co-occupying? And the answer is no. They would need to flip to fighters and then co-occupy that way in order to get that three co-occupied stronghold win that ECAS can have. The other question that had come up had to do with homebrew, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to do a whole episode on homebrew for battle language, but I don't mind talking about it a little bit. I think for me, there's quite a bit of homebrew out there, and I think a lot of it is quite hit and miss. There's definitely some stuff that I look at and I go, wow, that is very cool. And some of it has been, I think some of those things that I've recently reviewed that are on Etsy. But there are some other homebrew ideas out there. There's some really interesting stuff, I think, with the whole idea of the Dune Messiah plus idea of the greening of Arrakis, which I think is interesting. And I've been separately working on something on those ideas, but I don't know that that would ever be published, but I may eventually share it. But part of it was, stickers that you would put on the territories as they get green, almost in a legacy style version of Dune. and I think that would be really interesting. I don't know how practical it is in terms of a homebrew, and it would take a lot of play testing. You'd want to really have a good sense of what effect that's going to have on the game going forward, and how far forward you can really go. So that's pretty low priority for me. But what do you guys? There's some stuff because I know that on the Dune tabletop Discord there is a quite a thriving homebrew community, and some files shared, and a completely different version of Dune that gets played. And I don't participate in any of that, so I don't really have much of an opinion on it. But give you guys a chance if you want to shout out at something, or to talk in more detail, or not. You let me know.
The homebrew scene for Dune is kind of off the hook. I mean, once I started getting a grasp on the rules, I was churning out factions like crazy. I probably got like 7 or 10 different homebrew ones, and maybe even one of them is half decent.
And you'll have to share that, because like I'm always like kind of looking, because yeah, kind of like you, like I went down this rabbit hole of like, because Board Game Geek has like all of those like files that people have done, right? And then when you go to like TTS, it's like you type in Dune, and then you see like all of the mods that people have done, and it's like then you realize like, well, it's more than just like Dune Imperium or Dune Conquest, or what I like to call like Dune Classic, like the Gale Force 9, version that we all play and we all love. It's like, there's a dice version that this gentleman had came out with, and then it's been like reworked. So he had this like proprietary dice system, and then it went to D6s. And then there's a gentleman who came out with this kind of like dice, it's like a card game with dice called Conqueror of Dune. And I just went down this rabbit hole. I was just like, man, there's so much stuff. And I came across Dune Messiah, and I was looking through the rules, and I was looking at it's like they implemented where you get spice, but you also get water, and you use water in kind of interesting ways to pay for things. There's 2 different sects of Fremen, so it's like you've got the followers of Muad'Dib, and then you've got the like the outcast Fremen. What's the name of the siege?
Idawali.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. You got those guys. You got the remnants of House Carina still kicking around, and then they did a different version of the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and the Talaxu. And I was just like, man, this looks so fun. And I was just kind of putting feelers out there, like, hey, like, does anybody know about this? Has anybody played it? Because I'm like really tempted to try to do a print and play version of this, because, if I can get like a mat down and, some pieces, and just like, hey, let's see how it feels under the fingers. I'm all about it.
There's a few different areas where this sort of material appears. And for me, somebody had asked, where are we finding these things? For me, Etsy has probably been the most recent. I would say there's not a ton of homebrew stuff on Etsy yet, but it does seem to be growing. I think for a lot of players, Board Game Geek has been probably one of the oldest and most centralized place, because you can upload files that people can use for print and play, and sometimes they'll post links to like a Dropbox where people have put stuff if the files were just too big for Board Game Geek. And I know that on the Dune Tabletop Discord, you guys have been posting stuff there that people can download, or links to stuff that they can download. So those are probably some of your best sources, Board Game Geek and the Dune Tabletop Discord. I think probably one of the advantages that the Discord has is people actually giving it a whirl. And I think a lot of times it's imported into Tabletop Simulator, which is a really good way to try stuff out, rather than putting a huge expense into printing some stuff out, trying it out, and realizing, first of all, that the idea is not good, or if it is, like, oh, there's 30 typos in here, or I didn't really explain this very well. And so it's much easier to update it for TTS and then test it out, and to say, all right, does this work? How does it need to be adjusted? It is almost certainly going to need to be adjusted. Every idea that somebody has posted has been something that, in my opinion, was not ready for publication. It needed to be play tested quite a bit, and because of the asynchronous and asymmetrical, not so much asynchronous, mostly asymmetrical nature of the factions, but other effects as well. You'll find out that, oh, this works great with this setup, but as soon as you add in this faction, it doesn't work anymore. And now you have to either change it or get rid of it completely because it's just not going to work. The Bene Gesserit and the Emperor seem to be the two factions that have the biggest impact on what was otherwise a great idea. This would have been great, except that the Emperor can just give somebody 30 spice, and now this becomes completely untenable. Or, oh, he didn't really think about how advisors or whatever, all the other crazy things that Bene Gesserit do. Jaded, you were going to chime in on something, so what was that?
Yeah, I mean the main stumbling block of homebrew specifically with classic Dune is that just really really hard to make something that's actually good, especially like factions. Like I read a lot of homebrew. I love it, so I always check things out when people are posting them, and it's just I can't fault anyone for it because it's tough, but
yeah,
it's not great.
It's not just that too. I mean, part of it is, can you write something that's going to fit on a faction sheet? Because I've seen a lot of homebrew where I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is 3 sheets to fit all of that stuff on there. It's like 2.5 sheets just for basic, and now you're throwing in 8 different effects for advanced. And so yeah, sometimes it's like, you know what, maybe just simplify it. But part of the challenge is, can you write it concisely? And that has been a mixed bag, even for stuff that's been officially printed, stuff that we turn in to Gale Force 9, and as they're formatting it onto the sheets, and they're like, oh, this is a little bit longer than we want, and so they will try to truncate some of the text, or say, maybe if we say this, we say that. And a lot of times that's fine. They find some great shortcuts, or let's use 3 words instead of 8, which is how I write. But sometimes they inadvertently change something so drastically, and hopefully we catch it, but sometimes we don't. We're like, oh, I guess that's how this works now, because that's how it was phrased, and it's just too much work to say that was wrong. And yeah, so it can be a real challenge. And I've seen some ideas that were just, I think, way too ambitious. The other interesting thing is the challenge that we have with playing classic Dune is, part of it is a self-imposed rule, and it's the timeline, and it all centers around this first book, Dune, and the idea that any faction that we want to introduce to the game has to plausibly be able to interact with the other factions that were around them, and having to do with the characters. And the original designers, they did not want to go, even very much into Messiah. They didn't really want to go into Messiah at all. It had to be anything that could happen by the end of this book, which, again, because Edric is not in this book, but Edric, presumably, he's been a navigator for a while, so he was around during this book. And some of it had to do with, if we're using the prequel books, those take place a little before this, but we wouldn't want to use anything from the Machine Crusade, the Butlerian Jihad. We're like, nope, that's too far back. So it's a pretty narrow window. So even when we're using the extended universe, there are certain things that are just outside of the comfort zone. And again, it's the self-imposed rule. That's why I think with the idea of, doing a greening of Arrakis thing, it's more of a timeline thing. I think it would be a good legacy thing, and I'd want to actually go back and see how far back I could go with that game. Do I actually want to do anything from Brian and Kevin's Butlerian Jihad, or do I just go back a little ways? It'd be interesting because you can say, yeah, we're going to have the Fremen, we're going to have House Riches, which were the fief rulers of Arrakis before the Harkonnen. and then maybe some other contemporary factions there, and then you move forward in time, maybe all the way up to the God Emperor, maybe even beyond. I think it would be interesting to get those honored matres in there, um, the scattering and all the faction ideas that you could come up with from there. But that's a lot of people are like, when are honored matres going to be part of faction in Dune? And the answer is never. It's not. It's too far in the future. They're not.
That's like
Not gonna
asking.
work in.
That's like asking when the fish speakers are going to be
Exactly.
going to be coming. Yeah. It's funny you say that because like I'm almost finished with the third book in the Caladan trilogy, and it's like when Chome came out and I was looking at the leader disc, I was like, there's some familiar names that appeared in this faction, and they may or may not, hint, hint, spoiler alert, be found in those books. And, quite a few of them are very important to some of the subplots that are going on in that book. So I thought that was a nice touch that, those, because some of those names are, dukes and counts and whomever from, house minors, right?
Yeah.
Or they're maybe less powerful house majors, and it's like, is it worth trying to build an entire faction around, this one guy who's in this house, but it's like we only get introduced to him, so I see what you're saying about sort of the design constraints and, kind of being conscientious about what you do, who you put where and, things like that.
One of the other big constraints is we're looking to have 5 leader discs, and we'd really like those leaders to have names. To this day, seeing guild rep really rubs me the wrong way. It's like, I hate that there's no name for this guild rep. But they really wanted to have a guild faction, and there are very few guild leaders in the guild spacing guild faction. You've got Edric, who's not really a leader that you're going to throw into a battle. Everyone else is a smuggler. And then for decades now, there people have been coming up with their homebrew smuggler factions, and I get asked that all the time. When are you going to do a smuggler faction? And I was like, we kind of already have a smuggler faction, because everybody that we could put into a smuggler faction is in the Spacing Guild faction. And I think the last thing that the original designers wanted to do was say, oh, here we're going to print out, here we're going to have leaders that could be in both factions. That just makes their head spin. They don't even want to approach that. And even now it's saying, all right, we're going to come up with a replacement set of leaders for the guild so that we can then have a separate smuggler faction. Still not super doable. The latest book, which I actually finished reading today, Princess of Dune, and I might do a review of that at some point. They introduce one guild leader that you could throw in there. They introduce somebody in there, the Oracle, which I'm like, I'm not going near the Oracle with the 10-foot highliner. So I don't know. I would throw that in there as well. And they're only in like a really short and brief segment in the book. But there is a faction, I think, that's interesting that I might do a homebrew version of myself, and that would be the Liberation Fleet. I think there's enough leaders for that, and I've got some fun ideas for how I would implement that. So I would say go ahead and check that out. We had a couple of questions pop up, so let me see if I can see those. That's what's weird, is I can't see them. So someone asking about Karama. We'll get into that. What changes would I make to the original 6 factions if I could? I wouldn't change a lot. I think one of the things that I would want to do is maybe narrow the scope a little bit of everything that Bene Gesserit does, but probably not by a lot. But I do want to clarify a lot of how that works. I think that faction sheet could be reworded and redone, and certainly when that new FAQ does come out, we've done our best to try not to contradict the sheet so much, but I think a new sheet would be a good idea. I think part of it is just that the idea that whenever the Bene Gesserit are alone in a territory, their advisors automatically flip to fighters is problematic, and it is not really in line with the intent on coexistence from the Avalon Hill. But it's confusing because, of course, you don't have the two-state tokens, as I mentioned before. And so when you've got Bene Gesserit in a territory with somebody else, and you earlier said, yeah, they're coexisting, and then those forces aren't there anymore. Well, they're not coexisting because there's nobody else there. But should they count as fighters? And that is certainly a debatable thing. But I would fall on the side of no. I think that the idea that I can have advisors, for example, in a territory with my ally, and my ally full dials in order to win the battle so that they can boot out the other player, knowing that their ally, the Bene Gesserit, can just flip from advisor to fighter, and yay, we won the game. That was never part of the design intent. That much I do know from talking with the original designers. And it's never how we played it. So I'm already in the mindset of that's not a valid option. I know a lot of people are used to it, and especially people who were first introduced to the Gale Force 9 edition. That's just how they interpret it, and it's certainly not incorrect of them, but it does make for some really unsatisfying endings to games, in my opinion. But nobody jaded. What are your thoughts on that before we delve into some more of these questions that are popping up?
I would give a lot of thought on how to make Fremen a more interesting faction.
That's fair.
Because a lot of the expansion factions are very flashy, and even every other base game faction is quite flashy. They all have an ability where it's like, ooh, I wonder how that work. I mean, I play the Emperor and I get everyone's money when they bid, or I play Spacing Guild and I win at the end of the game. It's like crazy, but Fremen, they don't really have anything that's exceptionally flashy. They just have a lot of abilities that are nice to have, especially when you're playing advanced, where it's like 5 more abilities that are mostly just like rules clarifications as to how they work when you have those advanced rules like spice dialing and the double spice blows.
Yeah. I've often described the Fremen as a faction with an assortment of half advantages. So yeah, I think something extra special, and something that makes them more competitive. I think for me, the big change that I would consider would be just single rule set. So there's no more advanced and basic. There's one rule set, and then just finding a way to consolidate everything down so that you've got basically what everyone wants is all of the advanced advantages, because there's some really cool ones that are only in advanced, but then dealing with that battle, which I've talked about before, so I won't waste a lot of time talking about the elegance of basic combat versus advanced and whatnot. Let's see here. We got Dune Remaster versus, that's similar on their force tokens. Some people complain that Guild is just space truckers and boring. Yeah, I don't know if that's a question. I mean, I would say that, again, Guild is not one of my favorite factions to play. I've done a video, one of my top 5 favorite, one of my bottom 5 least favorite. And so for me, Guild has never been interesting enough that I crave playing it. But I definitely recognize that there are a lot of strengths to being the Guild. Having that really good regular income is terrific. And then, of course, I like in advanced, I like being able to choose when to take my turn. That's a major reason to like the Guild, I think, is that. But I don't think I would change the Guild much at all if I was going to do a new edition or reapproach and reimagine the game. Like I said, there's not a whole lot that I would change, but a lot of it has to do with just doing a single rule set and finding a way to make combat still elegant, but as impactful as you get from that idea of the spice styling.
I like the way Mr. Nobody plays Guild, where he just gifts people money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they don't ally with them. Come on.
It was one time.
I'll never let it go.
Yeah. So we had somebody was asking about the being able to revive extra forces as an alliance advantage for the Emperor. Now, that was actually something that I contributed to the 2019 edition, and part of it was there was a lot of talking about how, what is the Emperor doing for you? He's giving you spice, and what do you use spice for? Mostly for buying cards and for shipping. And so everybody can do that, and the Emperor being in a better position to do it, just didn't feel like that was interesting enough. It certainly is still useful, and technically, if the Emperor can just give you spice, you can then use that for revival payments, if that was a thing. But again, especially when you're talking about just the base game factions. There's only the Bene Gesserit and the Guild have a very limited free revival. So with the Emperor, it's like, okay, I can give you 4 spice, so you can get the other 2 out. For if you're allied with the Atreides and Harkonnen, that's 2 spice, and if they're allied with the Fremen, that's no advantage there at all. So we were sitting around and trying to come up with what's something else that would be useful that maybe the Emperor could do. And so just the idea that they can pay to revive more. And I think the other reason that I actually do like it is because it allows for somebody who has been devastated to get back in a little more quickly. It really makes that alliance with the Emperor pretty attractive for that reason alone. Or it lets you know, all right, I'm going to risk a lot of my forces knowing that the Emperor can then help me get back in. So even if you're not already down and out. In terms of thematics, I mean, again, it's wealth. So I don't find it any more or less thematic than any other element there where the Emperor is giving you spice for something. I think that if we're in the Dune universe and I need the Emperor to help me pay to get a bunch of Golas, I mean, that's really what we're talking about. We're growing troops in a tank. That makes sense. I mean, it's just really, if we wanted to really split hairs and talk about, is it thematic for that? It's not at all thematic that we're buying our forces out of the Tleilaxu tanks, because that was just never really a thing. It was certain important characters, mostly Tleilaxu masters, that the Tleilaxu were like, we're getting them out of the tanks right away. It was an expense, and there wasn't a lot of, we've got all of these historical characters, we've got to bring them back because we need another Shaddam because the old Shaddam died. That Duncan, Idaho is really where it starts and seems to end. So they didn't really have an interest in any other characters. Now we know that the end of Chapter House, spoiler alert, there was this notion that the Tleilaxu, of course, they've got their giant super 64 cran variety pack of historical people that they can bring back. And then, of course, Brian and Kevin went hog wild with that idea. So, but in terms of like, we need to raise an army, you're not going to the Tleilaxu to get your army. That even the Tleilaxu didn't really do that. They're like, we're not going to grow one. We're going to get all a bunch of sligs and we'll throw them into a battle if we need to. Not that they ever did. The Tleilaxu, in none of the books were like, yes, we're going to send in thousands of troops and try to take over this territory. I guess, they invaded Ix, but that was Ix's own fault for that. So here we go. We got a question here. Stoneburner. All right, this one I got to be able to read. This interface is really quite terrible. I don't know why I can't see these questions and they disappear. How does Stoneburner interact with the ECAS ally forces? All right, so vis-a-vis undialed forces. So the first you got to understand how does Stoneburner work, and we've got all of my treachery cards here. So let's get the actual wording so that that's going to be here in Stoneburner. It's a Rich S special treachery card. So when you reveal this, so you choose after battle plans are revealed, both leaders are killed or both leaders don't count. The player with the higher number of undialed force tokens wins the battle. So having undialed force tokens is the key here. And the way that the ECAS Occupy advantage works is the ECAS force tokens are not dialed. They're never dialed. You only dial whoever the ally is, and it doesn't matter which of the two factions is fighting the battle, whether it's ECAS or ECAS's ally. They're going to be dialing the other forces, and then what happens is you add to the dial half the value of the ECAS forces. So the ECAS forces don't factor into this. They are added in there, but they don't count as undialed forces. So this really is just a matter of it's the players, it's the allies' forces, ECAS's allies' forces versus the other player, whoever has the higher number of undialed forces. So there, your Occupy advantage as ECAS is not going to help you when it comes to Stoneburner. And so that's a good question because it's not immediately obvious. Certainly, I could have gone either way with that. I think some people would be like, okay, sure. But that's how I interpret it, is that the ECAS, it's a good advantage, but in a couple of circumstances, it doesn't really afford you anything. Do you guys want to weigh in on it? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you?
I think fundamentally the word undialed implies that there are forces that could be dialed. So that's an interpretation I agree with. Yeah. ECAS forces, you can't do anything with them, so they don't factor in at all.
It's a double-edged sword. There's certainly the one downside, which we had in a recent game. I was allied with the Bene Gesserit as ECAS, and they were like, "Yeah, we'll have a thrown battle here." And even though the other faction was throwing the battle, ECAS still was losing half of their forces. So I was not crazy about that idea. I was like, let's just fight it out because I'm going to lose those forces anyway. But my Bene Gesserit ally was like, well, I don't have to lose any forces because it is a thrown battle. So that, again, it's a really powerful advantage to be sure because you can get some great numbers in there. And the other great part about it, again, is the flexibility of which one of you is going to fight that battle. And you may be like, you know what? You've got better weapons and defenses, so why don't you fight that battle? And I think in that same game, at one point, I was allied with the Emperor, who was like, yeah, I'll fight this battle. And then they didn't have a good hand. I don't know why. I was like, I have a great hand, but you really wanted to fight the battle. So, yeah, we lost that battle. So yeah, I'll never forgive the Emperor. I should have allied with the Guild. I don't know what I was thinking about.
I think so. In the person who's asking the question defense, I think the reason why it's probably confusing is because, like, in your mind, you're like, oh well, yes, ECAS is losing 3, but they still have three forces there, and then the ally has whatever their stack is. So in their mind, they're like, oh well, crap, I can't use this weapon properly against them. But yeah, it's like Jaded said, if you kind of think through the wording of it, it's like when the ECAS chooses either they're going to fight or their ally fights, that is the stack that you look at for comparison's sake. So I had a harebrained idea kind of while you were going through the questions, kind of back up to the part about where someone was like, hey, if you could change the base game, like what would you do? And 2 things kind of came to mind. One was for the Fremen and one was for the Emperor. And they're both kind of thematic. They're probably not good. So, you guys feel free to laugh at me whenever I say my bad idea. So for the Fremen, I really feel like the Fedaykin or the Fedaykin, however they're supposed to be pronounced. One of the things in the lore was like, they learned the weirding way from Jessica and from Paul, and it really turned them into, the premier elite fighting force, like in the Dune universe. But on the table, it's like, if I'm not the Emperor, if I'm anybody else, I'm actually more scared of the Emperor or the Ix because they have more starred forces that they could, sort of unleash upon me, right, so to say. And especially with the Emperor, because he's got so much money, he's probably going to buy a really, really strong hand. So what about, what one possibility could be is that in any fight where there's a Fedaykin, as long as maybe like the Fremen play like a projectile weapon, so like a Chris knife or something, any worthless card that they play counts as a shield or something like that, right? Like something, because what I find is that at the start of the game, if you're lucky enough to get a weapon, when you get to the bidding phase, you'll probably get maybe a card, and typically it'll be like a worthless card, right? And so maybe you could give them enough gasoline to be like, well, hey, like I've kind of got my hand set up good enough, maybe they can kind of go for some risky battles, for some spice blows, or normally it's like, well, I got a dud card and a weapon, so it's like I can't play, Jameis or Stilgar or, Shawnee, with any type of, if you're going to play them, they're basically going to die. So there's maybe, a harebrained idea that, may or may not be trash. And the other one is I was thinking for the Emperor. So like ever since Mauritania and ECAS came out, we've got all the tokens for like the ambassador and the terror token. And, we had it with the chest with the no field token. I think it would be cool if the Emperor had tokens that, maybe he could like give his ally in combat, and the ally could reveal the token, and that many guys in the combat could count as like his Sardaukar, and he has to have them in his reserve, and then he sends them to the tanks because, if he's fighting with the Harkonnen and he's like, hey, take this token, Harkonnen is like, hey, 2 of my guys are going to count as double in the battle, and the Emperor's like, okay, well, 2 of my star forces, they go to the tanks, because thematically, that's kind of what he did, and he did that, with numerous houses, which is like he would send them in secrecy to battle with, whoever did that, back alley alliance thing with him.
Yeah. I find the Sardaukar one pretty interesting. I think probably what I would do at the Fremen was I would have the Fremen would be like the Bene Gesserit token. So I'd have all regular Fremen on one side and all Fedaykin on the other side. And what happens is when you get into a battle, any of your forces that survive the battle, you then flip them over, and now they're better because they've learned a thing or two from fighting this latest enemy, and so now you're adding starred tokens to your overall strength on the board through the game. So the ones that died, they go to the tanks. They're still regular guys, but once they can survive a battle, now you're upgrading your forces over the course of the game. So that's what I would probably try to do, because the idea again was that one of the messages that came out of the book was just the idea that all of the Fremen were super fierce, even before they got the weirding way thing. They went on about even their women and their children, like, these Sardaukar were killed by a bunch of women and a teenager, and there was one old guy there, and they're like, yeah, and the Fremen are like, yo, those Sardaukar were good. We 2 of our people were lost, and we think that was a big deal. So that's the idea that like all of the Fremen are pretty. And in advance, you get a little bit of that sense with all of your forces don't need spice to count at full strength, so you get a little bit of that. But again, if the spice styling is less of a thing, you need to find a different way to have that manifested in the gameplay. All right. Did any other?
I liked your first idea there, Mr. Nobody. It reminded me of I think it was an Idwali homebrew, but they had this thing where their leaders had a treachery card symbol on it, like poison weapon, poison defense, projectile weapon, projectile defense. And the idea was that if you played the leader and that slot was empty, it counted as if you had that card there. So like you play the guy so and he's got a projectile weapon symbol on his leader disc, and if you have no weapon, then you just get counted as though you had one.
Yeah. Because you bring up a good point about because all of the new factions, they either interact with a phase of the game in a really interesting way, or they come with an extra layer of interaction. Like, for example, with ECAS and Mauritania, it's like they can ally outside of a spice blow. You know what I'm saying? Like, you basically skip the nexus and you're just like, all right, you ship in here. Hey, listen, this may or may not be atomics, but we could be friends instead. And as a matter of fact, if you ally with me, that now puts us in a position to win the game, right? And it's interesting. And, the terror tokens are decently varied. And it's like, you don't know, you could lose half your spice. You could lose a card, the territory could just be set off by an atomic bomb. It's like, it's a very interesting game of like, is it worth the risk to go in there, right? And it could totally be a bluff. It could totally be a, well, maybe they're doing it to try to keep me out and it's nothing too bad. But if I go in there, is it worth the risk kind of thing? And yeah, I think with the framing, the biggest problem, and Mr. Jack has said this before, and I agree with him. It almost feels like things have to happen in the game, like Shai Hulud needs to show up, at the right spice blow at the right time. And it's like, wow, now I get to send 10 of my forces all the way across the map and I can just land in Carthag now, and it's like, but you're waiting on like something like that to happen. And there are plenty of games where, spice blow doesn't necessarily show up worm doesn't show up until, maybe turn 5 or turn 6. So you've got all these forces that are just kind of scattered about the map, and you're just like, well, I'm kind of disjointed, and I can't really, move around, in an efficient way because I was kind of hoping this worm would show up, or like the storm thing, where it only wipes out half your troops. It's like, it helps. Don't get me wrong, it definitely helps. But yeah, I do think that the Fremen probably need maybe like a little more oomph, and whatever that ends up being,
Yeah.
It's hilarious how one of the Fremen's abilities, the half losses in Storm, frequently players choose not to use it just because it's better than having the forces stranded in the desert that are completely useless.
I'll be honest with you. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't use it because of that reason. Because it's like, well, Storm's gonna blow by me, and it's like, you're right. Yeah, it's better, and especially with the homeworld, because it's like if I got my my Fedaykin in there, it's like, well, I can just sprinkle them out into the stacks that I have already out on the board. So it's almost better that they're they're no longer living.
Well, we got a question about dealing with factions with the stupid amount of spice. So somebody said that they're in a game against Chom, which was just raking in the cash, and they became almost too strong. And what's the best way to work against that? And you can certainly eat into Chom's income by being on Chom Charity, but that's not that's not really a great situation to be in. To be like, oh great, I'm taking 2 of your spice. So now you get 10 spice instead of 12 spice, but I only have 2 spice, which what am I going to do with 2 spice? So, certainly another economic faction might say, yeah, if I can spend everything, I'll take some of Chom's spice with their income because I know I'm going to get paid in the bidding phase, or I'm going to get paid in revival or shipping and movement. But again, I don't think any of those economic factions necessarily want to do that, certainly not as a tactic against them. I think part of it, though, is you've just got to. Chom is not a very military faction. They can, if you're playing advanced, of course, yes, they can afford to spy style high, especially if other factions are also battling before them in that round, so they're going to get some of that income possibly, and they can afford to revive a lot of their forces and or ship a lot of forces. So that's where their strength is militarily, but they've got pretty weak leaders, and they're relying on the fact that they got a 5-card hand to say, all right, hopefully I've got some good cards in there. But I think as soon as Chom starts messing around on the planet, you have to mess with Chom as well. And that's probably your best strategy, is just to keep chipping away at them. What do you guys think? What has been the most effective ways to counter Chom, in your opinion?
Chom is very much prone to death spirals, as I've heard people describe them. It reads like, oh, they get 12 spice every turn just for doing nothing. But you look at it, their leaders aren't very good, so they have to spend spice buying cards. And then they have no free revivals, so they have to spend spice to revive forces always. And they have no combat advantages, so, hey, believe it or not, they have to spend spice to dial up their forces to be competitive. So they're really a faction where you get a lot of spice easily, but you also have to spend more than most other factions on other things just to be competitive.
Yeah, you just gotta keep hitting them.
I'm willing to bet, and correct me if I'm wrong, if they can hear me and they want to respond to this, but I'm willing to bet probably what happened in that game. The reason why Chum ran away with it is because the other factions hit each other too fast, too hard, ran out of resources. Everyone's pretty low on spice, and then Chum essentially took over the bidding phase. Maybe them and presumably their ally took over the bidding phase, got all the cards that they needed, and then they started fighting when everybody had like one, maybe two cards in their hand. Because I typically find it with the economic factions, it's not spice you necessarily need to be worried about. It's cards in hand. Because as soon as you get low on cards in hand and you don't have spice, or even if you have a decent amount of spice, the problem is like, you see this a lot with like the Emperor in particular. It's like, as soon as he allies with somebody, you're like, okay, well, maybe we'll get card 5, maybe we'll get card 6, right? Because typically it's like his ally will buy, the first few, he maybe buy, 1 or 2, and then it's like, well, you guys can have the scraps or, whatever's left over. And I'm willing to bet that's probably what happened. So what my recommendation would be is that if you can see and kind of pay attention, because if Chom is like very hands-off, and they're not spending much, like they're being very frugal, and maybe they're buying like a card or 2, and you can see they're kind of playing, like puppet masters, sort of waiting for everybody to wipe each other out. I would probably take territory. B, I would at least try to get 1, maybe 2 cards in the bidding phase. And then C, I would become very diplomatic with the other factions on the table and be like, hey, look, like, there's a shark that is waiting in outer space for us to bloody each other so that they can just come down here and just cause a lot of problems, right? So we have to be very, very mindful of the damage that we do to each other, and you can do like, block strongholds, you can throw fights, because if they're not on the board, they can have a million spice and it won't matter. You don't win the game by having all that spice. You win the game by controlling the territories. But I really, it's cards. So like if you can earlier in the game, if you can try to be competitive in the bidding phase, and some factions obviously do it better than others, do that. Try to take a territory if you don't already start on the board with one, and then if you can afford to, go after some spice blow. So even if they do take over the next bidding phase, you'll at least have some in your reserve that you can try to be competitive on the next phase, right? And that timing of their what is it called? The inflation token. Yeah, pay attention to when they use that, because if they use the double inflation, typically it's a sign. It's like, okay, they're going to try to buy a lot of cards, and they're going to try to hit hard on that turn, because they're not going to get a lot. They get nothing on the next turn. So if you can punish them like in that pivotal moment, then you will find that tide will swing very quickly away from them and back into more of a balance of power approach for the rest of the table. At least in my experience, that tends to be the way that it plays out.
Better yet, Karama them when they double the Chom, and now they have 0 spice for 2 turns in a row.
Yeah, got to be real careful as Chom when you want to double Chom Charity. You want to know where those Karama cards are, or know that they've been played. But yeah, you got to chip away at them, because the temptation for Chom is, I've lost 2 or 3 forces. I'm just not going to pay to revive them. I've got more. But if they lose 2 or 3 more again, now they're in essential. They're going to start spending money to get forces out, and how much are they willing to spend? So yeah, there's probably not one great, here's their big Achilles heel and hit them with this. It's going to really depend on what every other faction is doing as well, and are the other factions going at each other while Chom is watching and waiting and building up their strength. Which is how I play Chom. I get some forces on the planet, but maybe I leave them in the sink. Maybe I go after a stronghold like Habanya or Tuix with a sizable force, but mostly I'm building up my hand. I want to get a nice hand of cards, and I'm not necessarily spending a lot on a card. You say, all right, great, I've got 12 spice. I can spend 6 spice on a card. I'm like, you know what? I'll spend maybe 3 or 4 spice. I might bid it up on something, especially if we don't know what that is. We don't have a good sense of what it is because nothing's truly worthless for Chom. So they're like, if I can get a couple of cards for 3 spice, even if they're garbage to everybody else, that's stuff. I get 2 cheap heroes, I can just sell one. So that's not a huge problem. I can sell the worthless cards if I am hard up for spice. I like to use the worthless cards though for their effects. So I'm also like, all right, this is a worthless card that might dictate what I want to try to do with it. If I've got a ballast set, then I am going to go into a territory, especially one that people are more likely to move into, like Habanya, rather than ship into, or vice versa, whichever. So that's about it for this one. I thought this was pretty successful, so we'll do another one of these. This format is actually much easier for me to do. It's less work, and I can do them more regularly. So what I'll do is I'll schedule another one of these. Again, people will be able to submit questions in advance if they want, or they can join the live chat. And I'm going to try to figure out how I can see the questions and keep them up there so that I can make sure that I don't miss stuff. I might try 2 screens and using another one for that. But we'll also have the Discord chat open. So join the Future Pastimes Discord if you want to jump in and participate live. You can be a part of the conversation, or you can just pop in with your question and then disappear into the ether. I think that was good. And again, if there's a specific topic that you think that we should devote an entire episode to, and then we can limit the questions to stuff in there. And it can be, let's talk about the movie, or talk about the book, or we can stick to the game. That's fine with me. I'm happy to talk about whatever, and we'll see how it goes. But on behalf of the guests, thanks for watching, and we're going to shut it off there. If I can figure out how to stop this. I don't know, there's no off button, so there's no way to stop. I guess I'm streaming now for the rest of my life. I'm just going to have a live shot of my bookshelf here, or my game shelf here. Oh, there we go. There's an X. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you again soon.